Thank you very much, Minister. Thank you for describing the harsh reality we face in the ever more complicated global order, but also looking into the future, and we will follow up on that directly. Because, as we heard from the Vice President, even though EU is still the global superpower in terms of trade, having more than 70 countries, having access to more than 70 countries with trade deals, we are seeing the world is getting more and more complex, and we witness rise of new economic powers that challenge the international order, as the Minister described. Before we dig into the discussion, I would like to make a quick announcement about the rules. I will give opportunity also for you in the audience to ask questions. You can use the application Slido via QR code. You can find the QR code inside of your desks on the tables. So I'll make sure to give the opportunity also for you to ask questions. Please use it. We will speak about the changing global environment, as we already mentioned, but also about the future of EU trade policy. But before we do that, I want to stop for a while in something that happened yesterday. And I'm sure everybody already knows the breaking news. EU has announced preliminary tariffs up to 38% on Chinese electric vehicles. And I would like to ask each of you, what's your take on that? I will start with Malorie Schaus. Compared to US decision to impose tariffs up to 100%, do you think this measure will be effective?
So, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you very much for the invitation to participate in the summit. So, actually, what was foreseen at the start of the investigation in September of last year was actually to impose a tariff similar to what the US at the time was imposing, around 27.5%. Now it would be 38%. It's actually a middle ground between what was foreseen at the start and what a recent study establishes as being an effective tariff to protect the EU manufacturing industry, which would be 50%. Now, why this middle ground? First, as I'm a lawyer, I will mention the law. But second, also because of the close economic relations with China. First, we are in a setting of regulated protectionism. So we have to pay attention to the rules of the WTO and the basic regulation at EU level. And so there it's stated how we have to determine injury, taking into account subsidized imports. Then with respect to the economic links, it's that we have to limit retaliation on the side of China. We have to make sure that we go in the direction of decarbonization, so we need EVs. And third, we have to pay attention not to interfere too much with partnerships between manufacturing companies on both sides, the EU and the Chinese sides. For instance, Stellantis, who announced recently that they had a partnership with a Chinese company. And so just some figures, and then I give the floor to my colleagues. For instance, the US may impose actually 100% on EV cars because the imports of China by the US of EV cars is just 2% of the EVs. In the EU, within just 2 years, there has been a big concentration of imports of EVs coming from China. And so there is, of course, overcapacity on the side of China, but there is also a need of EVs. The exports, EU exports in mobility to China have also increased importantly over the past 2 decades, up to times 34. So it means from 0.5% to now 17%. And for instance, to give an example, Volkswagen, 20% of its revenues come from those exports to China. Then there is a lot of investment inside China, so that's a risk for retaliation. And there the investments are increasing and are up to 66% of the EU investment is in the mobility sector, with number 1 and third investor in China are two car industries of the EU. And then the partnership, I think that you have heard about it, is the question of Stellantis. So how do we deal with these? And undertakings are themselves trying to find ways out. And one is to have a partnership and bring the EVs to Europe, but still avoiding overcapacities. And why having those partnerships? For taking the technology, but also for then investing in R&D and going forward at the EU level to the next generation technologies. I leave it to that.
Madam Santos, in the discussion in EU, we focus a lot on regulation, but it seems to me that often we lose sight of the reality that is changing, especially in the sector of EVs. As Malorie Schaus has said, the sharp rise of imports from China, but also development of American technologies. We are still trying to find. Is this new tariff that was announced going to be effective enough for car manufacturers? Will it save car manufacturers in Europe?
Good afternoon to everyone, and I will be representing Business Europe, so the umbrella business organization. So of course, we have to take into account the interests of the whole industry and not only one specific sector. And I want to reinforce this because what I'm going to say is going to be the position of Business Europe. We are not, of course, interfering in specific trade defense actions. That's not our role. What we say is that whenever the conditions are there, whenever you see that you have the conditions to initiate an investigation, either because there is subsidies or because there is a dumping from the part of a producer in the third country, and that is creating a problem in the European market and a problem for European producers, the Commission should act in close cooperation with the industry. And this is what happened. In this specific case, the Commission decided to do a so-called ex officio investigation, so not requested by industry, precisely because even within the industry, there's very different opinions about this particular case. As Marius was saying, we have a very different situation with a lot of manufacturing going on in China and a lot of cooperation with China, including on the batteries. Because, of course, most of the batteries we are using for our electric vehicles are produced by China. And this is the reality today. Now, the important thing is that we are acting in the European Union according to the rules. So we will not have 100% duties, because we are following the rules that we have, and we need to follow according to the information we are getting in the procedure, according to the real damage that is being caused to the industry. And this is very important, because we also have to say that China, if China wants to act, it should act within the rules. If China thinks that the procedure is not legal, they should act. They can go to the WTO. If Chinese companies are not happy with the findings of the investigation, they can act. They can provide information within the procedures. So this is very different from what the US has done. That is a unilateral action without possibility of third countries providing input. And by the way, in the US, you also have then exceptions. It means that in certain cases, you can actually import without the duty. So this is very important for us, is that we remain within the rules and that China remains within the rules. My final point is that what is happened, or what happened now with the EVs, risks happening in other sectors. We know that overcapacity, because China continues to produce, and consumption in China is very low, because the economy is not performing well, because the consumers in China do not feel confident enough to spend more. It means China continues to produce and continues to export. And this will lead to more problems in more sectors. We see already problems in chemicals, machinery. So it means that in the future, we should also consider that if China does not address the problem of capacity, if we not have more an increase on demand, on consumption in China, the problem we have today with electric vehicles will very likely happen in other sectors. And then what Europe needs to do? Well, Europe needs to safeguard its economic interests. The US done it. Turkey also imposed 40% duties very recently, and other third countries are doing. So I think at one point China will eventually recognize that they need to change their policies if they don't want to be shut out of the market. But I think we are still long way from that prospect. So I see in the future more potential for this kind of actions, and of course also the potential for action from China. But if you ask me if I think they will retaliate very strongly, no, I don't think so.
Well, let's follow up on that. Cora Jungbluth, as an expert on China, I would like to know what reaction do you expect from China? Do you think they will just accept it? Will they use the opportunity to react in line with rules of WTO, or are we maybe entering or risking entering a trade war with China?
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you very much for the invitation. I would like to add one thing concerning the EV issue. I think it really is a predicament for the European Union because on the one hand, it wants to achieve the green transition. On the other hand, it has to achieve economic security and safeguard against unfair competition. And this really is a very difficult issue to solve. So I think the EU had to act on the EV question, and I think they took a measured and differentiated approach. As you see, tariffs differ between single countries and the sector, so they're really trying to take an evidence-based approach here. You see, as Luisa mentioned, other countries taking similar approaches, and one could question if the 100% in the US is evidence-based or not. And if the EU had not acted, there would be trade diverting effects. The EU is a very important market for Chinese EVs, but so was the US. So what cannot be exported to the US from China might add to the pressure on the European market. Having said that, the question if China will react, of course, they reacted rhetorically already and saying, well, it's not true, it's a protectionist measure, and the EV sector in China is based on market criteria. But if you research the Chinese economic system, you know that state subsidy, state support on the local and central level is in the DNA of the system. So, but the European Union only looked at direct and concrete subsidies like tax reliefs and direct transfers to the companies. So maybe they even only are based on the tip of the iceberg of subsidies in China. Also, the European Union leaves open a way of negotiations. We don't have the tariffs yet. It will be decided in June, and until July. Until then, the European Union will try to negotiate with China for a solution. China will, if China retaliates, it will not be very strongly, because I agree in that with Luisa. China has huge domestic economic issues, and China's economic model is still based on export. And EVs are among the new 3 key export items: EVs, lithium batteries, and solar modules. So it's very hard to tackle the overcapacities that come into existence if a certain good is being labeled as the key export good by the Chinese government. So they will try to take modest measures that do not provoke another retaliatory reaction by the European Commission, and they will, from my point of view, not want to enter a fully fledged trade war with the European Union. They have too much other problems to solve at hand.
So does it mean that you agree what Madame Santos has said, that China sooner or later, I hope I'm not paraphrasing it wrong, but sooner or later will have to abide by the rules if it wants to continue using benefits of liberal global trade order?
I think China will try to find a solution with the European Union. They will try to negotiate. But as I said, EVs are a key product in China, and I'm rather skeptical if any negotiated solution will have this kind of long-term impact. Maybe the EU and China can find a short-term solution for this, but we also know from other deals that China did not always abide by the rules. If you look at WTO, or also the the Phase 1 deal negotiated by Donald Trump when China promised to buy goods to a certain amount of US dollar, which has not happened until now. So we'll see if this really works out.
Madam Schaus, Valdis Dombrovskis in his opening speech said that EU has every interest in defending the global the global trade order. Is this attitude or this strategy naive, or is European Commission right that it has to fight within the rules to keep the rules alive?
Thank you very much for this question. I'd like to adopt more of a conceptual approach on this question and to really setting the scene. Where are we? It's not just in the news, we are also in concept and in theory. And why is the EU acting like this? It's because there is a theoretical background to it as well. So what we see, as it has been mentioned by the Minister and by the Vice President of the Commission, we are in a trend of fragmenting trade relations, a gradual reorientation of international trade along geopolitical lines, and they either will unfold into a continued but reinforced status quo, which is what is called in economics a spaghetti ball effect, with the coexistence on non-exclusive regulatory frameworks, or the worst is a polarization. So it means really a split of exclusive regulatory frameworks, which would be bad for everyone, and for the EU in particular as well, because it's a normative power or a normative power. Now we have this, and then we have the rules-based multilateral trading system. It still exists. 60% of EU trade is based on the MFN terms, and the long-term horizon, as it has been mentioned by the Minister and by the Vice President, is the rules-based multilateral trading system as reformed and modernized. Now, what is the long term? It's 2035, 2040. Now, turning now against this background, turning to this open strategic autonomy, which is the towards which the EU trade policy is reoriented. It has been more concretely defined through the years. Last year, 2023, de-risking strategy, European economic security strategy. What is important to note, because the first question was on China, is that the EU trade policy, of course, this reorientation is defined to a large extent by our relations with China and the geopolitical tensions, but it remains agnostic. It's important to mention this, and I will go later for the last question. I will answer why it is important to remain agnostic. It's actually very intelligent on the side of the EU. So what does it mean, open strategic autonomy? It's openness. Openness, as it has been mentioned, remains the foundation of the EU trade policy. And why openness? Because openness is driven and takes advantage of the comparative advantages and the economies of scale. And this leads to what? To growth, to innovation, to investment, to consumer choice, to global sustainable development. We cannot speak of the global commons and the green transition without openness. And in particular for the EU, just to bring some figures here, trade represents 35% of the GDP of the EU. It involves 35 million European jobs, and the EU is the world's main provider of FDI and the second destination globally for investment. Now, we go to the strategic autonomy term. It's added to openness. Openness remains the underpinning floor. The strategic autonomy term relates actually to a very limited extent till now to geoeconomics. Geoeconomics is actually founded on the logic of conflict. So the size of the economy as a source of power matters. And for the EU, it's quite challenging, and that's why there is a need to revitalize its economy. Now, what geoeconomics supports and advocates for is to support domestic industries and to shield them from foreign competition. But in full application, geoeconomics leads to a zero-sum game, stagnation, and no growth. So what the EU is doing with the strategic autonomy term, so enhanced resilience and competitiveness, greater assertiveness, improved sustainability, is actually based on this, but to a very limited extent, because it combines the trade policy to the industrial policy. But it adopts really a targeted approach. This is also very important, a targeted approach, and it's based still underpinning is the openness. Now, I don't know if I still have a bit of time to give some examples that show you what are the risks and opportunities of this strategic autonomy terms. So if we go into the enhanced resilience and competitiveness of the EU economy, and the stream of industrial policy implies, if we look at the CHIPS Act, the Critical Raw Materials Act, the Net Zero Industry Act, implies some form of reshoring. Now, is it going to be feasible? Some economists say that it's not going to be feasible, for instance, in some sectors, solar panels. And it's right that reshuffling supply chains brings about an increased cost. But when people say that we are moving from efficiency to resilience, that's not really a paradigm shift like this, because a resilient state may be in the longer term, despite the reshuffling in the transition, may be in the longer term also efficient. Now, what is important to note is that at the EU level, and as we see it also globally, is that reshoring often takes the shape more broadly to be involved with other partners, with other states, and so may be based on the comparative advantages of the different partners. And often those partners are developing countries, and so we integrate them further in the global value chains. And there, this cooperation, so through industrial policy, some form of reshoring, we are bringing developing countries in the global value chains, and we are supporting the re-globalization. So we are in all these forms of re-efficiency, re-globalization. So it's not, so this to underline that there are risks, and the risk would be, for instance, and then I will stop, the risk is, for instance, when you reshore that other companies with industrial policy, other companies are going to ask as well for reshoring, for subsidies. This is the risk, it's the protectionist spiral, but to avoid it is to remain very targeted as to the sectors, and as I mentioned at the previous question, is even to be more targeted than the EU is in the current acts that it has adopted. That's to say, to focus on next generation technologies. And I stop here.
Thank you for bringing context into the debate, which is very important. You mentioned several times strategic autonomy, which is another favorite buzzword in Brussels corridors. And I would like to now turn to Luisa Santos and ask you to have a better picture of what we are actually talking about. If this fragmentation continues in global trade, what will this mean for European industry, business, etc.?
Well, I would say that I would like to start by saying that we focus on the openness. We defend the need to keep the European market open. Of course, using the tools that we have to level the playing field or to mitigate distortive practices. But it's important that we keep our market open for two obvious reasons. First, because we will not be able to produce everything in Europe. That's a myth. We will not be able for several reasons. First, because we don't have everything in Europe. And second, because the cost is simply unbearable. So if we do that, the risk is that actually it leads even to more investments being done outside Europe, and contrary to the initial idea that investments will be done in Europe. So we need really to keep the market open to ensure that the production that we have in Europe at the moment remains here and that the companies remain competitive. And this also means that we need to open new markets. I think the minister said that. We have done, unfortunately, very, very poorly in this Commission when it comes to trade agreements. I would not say it's the fault of the Vice President, but the track result is very low. What do we have? We have ratified the agreement with New Zealand. That's very good, but it's a very small market, 5 million people in the end of the world. We have the modernization of Chile, and we have Kenya. So none of these is big agreements. None of these are big markets. And we need those big markets. Because if we really are serious about mitigating risk, if we are really serious about resilience of our supply chains, we need to have more markets. Because otherwise our companies will be in a very difficult position. They are what they have today. So what we have today is US first market, China second market. And they're both risky, by the way, because talking about friendshoring, I mean, we don't agree with this idea of friendshoring. What is friendshoring? The friends today could be the enemies tomorrow. How do you know? So we're all for ideas that we need to agree on certain principles with our trading partners. This is important. But we should not only deal with countries that we consider to be like-minded. I repeat, what is like-minded today might not be tomorrow. I recall what happened with Russia. They used to be a very good partner at one point. Look where we are today. If we have a change in the US administration, we don't know what will happen with the relation with the US. So that could be actually a very high risk for all of us. So that's why I think for us the important thing is diversification. Will there be regionalization and market fragmentation? I think before we reach the conclusion that this is a bad idea, we will have to go there. We will definitely have more market fragmentation, more regionalization. Who will suffer? The consumers, because we will all pay more for the goods that we have today. And some goods might not even be available in the future, or they will be available but at a very high price. So this is the price we will have to pay. And I think, again, we will need to do this way of, having more spaghetti ball of rules, having less market integration, to arrive at the stage where we realize, actually, that this is not the way, because in the end, it will cost us more. It will lead to more conflicts. But by the way, what we are seeing today with security is reasonable in the current context. But if you don't engage, if you don't trade, if you don't have economic relations, then the risk of conflict is also bigger. So that's the way that we are progressing. And for companies, final point, for companies, they will find a way, the big ones. The problems will be for the smaller ones that, of course, depend very much. They don't export directly in many cases. They depend on the big ones. If those move to other markets, then smaller companies in Europe could also face more problems of competitiveness.
We will talk about free trade deals in a while, but before we do so, I'd like to move to Slido, because we have two questions still on tariffs against China. Very, very interesting topic, I would guess. And I'll ask you for quick answers, if you may. The first one is actually on the number. 38% is the highest proposed tariffs, but only 70% for highly cost-competitive BYDs. it is far from this 50% suggested by expert. Does it provide enough breathing room? Anyone?
Well, the Commission tried to take a measured approach to this and really define tariffs evidence-based, and this is why there are different tariffs to different players, depending on if the companies cooperated or not and how many subsidies the Commission could find, so to say. And to my knowledge, BYD cooperated, and the result shows that probably BYD, being a private company, might have received less subsidies directly than state-owned companies, for example.
Thank you. And the second question is, it was mentioned in the discussion that China is emphasizing on 3 industries, such as EVs, we already spoke about. Are there any particular industries the EU should focus on to remain competitive?
Me again? Yeah. Of course, I mean, EVs, semiconductors, artificial intelligence, there quantum computing, there are quite a few key technologies which the European Commission is already investigating and supporting. And yes, it's very important for the EU to look into the key technologies of today and tomorrow and see that the EU remains fit in these or will become fit in these.
So let's move in the remaining time also on FTAs. As already mentioned, it is getting harder and harder to actually negotiate successfully and then also to ratify something. The trade deals are getting ever more complex. EU is evidently using it also to a little bit impose European rules and standards on others, or impose, negotiate, but to build on its influence. I would like to know if this approach is the right way forward. Isn't it time maybe to rethink the approach in the new reality we face right now? Malorie, Schaus.
About the future with respect to the...
Because you spoke about strategic autonomy, so in this context, we need trade partners, right?
Yes, I will perhaps broaden it a bit. So to keep conceptual and to conclude actually the argument that I started as to the future of the EU trade policy. So what are the next steps that are needed, but in a more conceptual sense, and I hope you will follow me. So what we are, and yeah, so this reorientation towards open strategic autonomy is a change in degree. It's not a change in nature and will remain, I think, as you told us with the openness, a change in degree. And any trade policy has to integrate some degree of openness. Now with open strategic autonomy, we have this openness and then a greater level of autonomy with perhaps some, yes, spaghetti ball effect, so reshoring, friendshoring, plurilateral agreements, etc. But also some adjusted forms of cooperation and enhanced possibilities, and this we haven't mentioned actually, enhanced possibilities to impose more restrictions, but based on predefined objectives. As I mentioned, the strong aspects of this trade policy are this targeting approach, targeting specific sectors or even technologies, and then also, and this is this greater assertiveness aspect, is also targeting specific distortions and geopolitical issues. The second strong aspect of this trade policy is the agnostic approach. And here I come in mentioning why this agnostic approach is important. It's not just for managing fragmenting trade relations currently, but it's also to be able to integrate fundamental changes that are happening in the economy and in the changing economic models, like circular economy, which actually, when we speak of reshoring, the circular economy will lead, once mature, will lead to more forms of integrated economic models within a single entity or different entities. And also, this agnostic approach is important because that's how the EU can also lay the foundations for the rules-based multilateral trading system and its modernization. Now, as I said, the path of open strategic autonomy is mapped out by geoeconomics, and there could be a reinforcement in the future, hopefully a transition period. It could lead, and this depends actually on the implementation of the measures and how the EU trade policy is going to evolve. It could lead to fragmentation, but there the EU has a historic responsibility, and there, that's where I want to come, is that the EU should define, beyond the different objectives that it's following now with open strategic autonomy, so resilience, competitiveness, sustainability, assertiveness, it should go beyond these to define an overall perspective for its open strategic autonomy. In other words, the EU has to adjust its positioning. And already now, in saying no longer in reaction, but in a proactive mode and in a mode of creation. Of course, this is difficult in a period of instability, but it's very important. It needs a lot of political will and a lot of means, but this is necessary for us to avoid losing sight of what is happening in this fragmenting world.
Yeah, still 3 remaining minutes, so I'll just ask you for quick answers. We still didn't take into account the results of the elections and the fact that we are now in process of approving new strategic agenda. What should be the new main task for the European Commission in order to make trade policy more, let's say, practical, or trade deals more ratifiable? What should be done in the next couple of months and years?
Well, I think there are several things the EU needs to do. First, it needs to separate the trade part clearly from the other part, the part that needs to be ratified by national parliaments. I think that's one important step. The other thing is we need to gain the trust of our trading partners. And this means as well engaging on explaining better some of the autonomous measures and some of the legislative measures that the EU has taken that have a strong impact on trade, and we didn't talk about them. Deforestation regulation, the carbon border adjustment measure, the due diligence directive that will come, so forced labor ban regulation, all these legislative actions of the EU will have a strong impact on trade. And we need to make sure that we mitigate some of these negative impacts, because otherwise it's not just a question of the trade agreements and the absence of trade agreements, is that the fact that third countries will have very serious problems in the future to access the European market, and so do we as Europeans to have access to input from these third trading partners. So I think we need to act on these 2 levels, and this is quite urgent to avoid major problems in our supply chains and in our trade flows with the rest of the world.
Same question on you.
Thank you. Well, the new Commission should focus on a coherent and coordinated trade agenda, but I am very afraid that the growing fragmentation of the European Parliament, which has to approve of trade deals, and the rise of right-wing parties, which tend to be more focused on economic nationalism, will make ratifying trade deals even more difficult than it has been so far. I mean, you have to imagine the EU did not even manage to finish the deal with Australia, which is deemed a like-minded partner. So this is something that really worries me, because free trade deals are a key tool of the European Union. It's in its direct competence. The second point is partnering on equal footing or an eye level, especially with countries from the Global South. And representatives from the Global South are quoted like, when China visits, we get an airport. When the West visits, we get a lecture. So the EU really has to come to eye level with partners from the Global South and make a real attractive alternative offer to what China is offering. And this would be a tricky task, which needs more coordinated action. And unfortunately, this will be very hard to achieve in the next 5 years.
Unfortunately, we are running out of time, but we have still a lot of questions on Slido, so I'll ask just one of them, and I'll ask you for a very brief answer. And to end on a bit positive note, I'll pick this one. If we see all the countermeasures taken in third world against China, is it in any way an opportunity for European industry? Opportunity also for European industry if in third countries, we see rise of tariffs, for example, against Chinese export.
Yes, it could be an opportunity if we manage to grab it. I'll bring the example of Mercosur. I mean, we see the Chinese are there already. They are already in the business of exploiting critical raw materials. They are building the supply chains there, and we are 20 years discussing whether we should have or not an agreement with Mercosur. So we are losing the opportunities here.
I'll end up here. Thank you so much for all your answers, for your insight. Our guests were Cora Jungbluth, Bertelsmann Stiftung. Thank you very much. Luisa Santos, Business Europe. Thank you. And Malorie, Schaus, Center for European Policy Studies.